In this lecture, I'll be discussing the early years of American anthropology and the dramatic influence that Franz Boas had on American anthropology as a whole. Early American anthropologists followed in line with the early unilineal evolutionists. This influence was both from Europe as well as the United States. We see the work, of course, of Spencer, Morgan, and Tyler that we had discussed earlier, and this evolutionary emphasis gets put forward into American anthropology. Some of the things that are perhaps a little bit different from the earlier readings, aside from them being slightly more accessible in terms of language used, is that many of the anthropologists at this time had adopted a advocacy perspective, advocating for the rights of Native American peoples within the United States. There was also early work in the context of participant observation, and you can see here to the right, this is Frank Cushing right here. He is sometimes credited by some as the founder or the first individual to truly engage in participant observation. Cushing was also known for his work on what he referred to as the reciprocal method. We see later on within anthropology this being taken up as the reflexive approach within anthropology as a whole. Although I'm mentioning Cushing here, I should note that John Wesley Powell was really seen as the sort of the architect of early American anthropological thought, which again was in line with the unilineal evolutionists. So Franz Boas comes onto the scene, and he's trained in the physical sciences, and he really develops the first true American school of anthropological thought. So he's a pioneer in this sense. And he trains an entire generation of anthropologists. And to the extent that they align with him or diverge from his ideas, really forms the cornerstone of what is American anthropology today. He is responsible in part for bringing forth the idea of the four-field approach within anthropology. Again, he's trained in the physical sciences, so certainly biological anthropology is in his wheelhouse, but he's also considering cultural anthropology. And for Boas, the projects were twofold, truly, to argue against evolutionary theory in part, and there's a couple prongs to that, as well as the interrelated theme of arguing against race-based science, or a scientific justification for racism, as many biological anthropologists were doing at that point. He, along with his students, believed in the diminishing resources that were present in the ethnographic, ethnological record, and for Boas, the major project was going out and collecting these resources before they diminished. But at the same time, there were strong advocacy positions amongst the Boasians that I'll discuss throughout this lecture. John Wesley Powell was the second director of the U.S. Geological Survey, and he's known not only in the context of anthropology and the social sciences, but also for his work in the physical sciences, and particularly geography and geology. He, or what we might refer to as environmental studies today, he looked at the American West, and he has a rather interesting approach to it, which others have picked up in the 1970s, and the notion of bioregionalism. So we see here early anthropological work, early ethnological work, is not really separated from the sciences as a whole. And indeed, within anthropology today, there are calls for more holistic integration of both the physical, biological sciences in the context of social and cultural sciences as well. As the second director of the U.S. Geological Survey, he noted that only a portion of the American West was suitable for agriculture. And what he proposed was actually quite different than what we got. He proposed small, locally controlled dams and not centralized, massive projects that dominate the landscape today. So, for example, where I did my dissertation work on the Tohono Nation in southern Arizona, there is quite a bit of discussion about water resources. The Central Arizona Project, which is essentially diverting water from the Colorado, and then, of course, all of the discussions, debates, arguments over who has the water rights within the West as a whole. If Powell had had his way, a lot of these discussions would essentially not be happening, and we might see very different development patterns overall in the context of the West. We might also ask ourselves, since the dispossession of Native peoples occurred later in the American West, we might also ask ourselves how this might have impacted the reservation system as a whole and the consolidation of lands in the American West as a whole. He was also the director of the Bureau of Ethnology, which was founded in 1879 at the Smithsonian Institution, and he occupied that position until his death in 1902. Under his leadership, an influential classification of North American Indian language was published along with the help of Franz Boas. He was certainly in line with evolutionary theory, and here he certainly departs from Franz Boas by dividing all societies into savages, barbarians, and civilization. So we can see the influence of these three grand stages of Lewis Henry Morgan here with the work of John Wesley Powell, at least in his conceptualization overall. In the text early on in McGee and Worms, we don't see too much mention of American anthropologists or other anthropologists or theorists that influenced anthropological thought that are women. But in fact, there are a multitude of women over the course of anthropological theory. There's some suggestion from feminist perspectives that they've certainly been downplayed in the anthropological record as a whole. We'll discuss this more throughout the class. But Alice Fletcher was an early ethnographer. She lived from 1838 to 1923. And she was firmly rooted in the savage culture dichotomy, so in the context of an evolutionary perspective. She was a member of the Archaeological Institute of America, so we can see aspects of multiple fields in Fletcher's work. She was an advocate not only of Native American rights, but also key in discussions and debates about women's suffrage. With Native American rights, she was a key advocate in the Dawes Act. She also engaged in collaborative work with Native American researchers and co-published on the Omaha with an Omaha Indian. It is still looked at today as the definitive work on the Omaha. And again, I mean, this is in the early 1900s where she's co-publishing this with Omaha man. So we see here clearly the persistence of her work in time. She was associated with the U.S. government and worked with the U.S. government in a number of capacities. In 1888, she published Indian Education and Civilization, which was a special report of the U.S. Bureau of Education. In 1898, the Congress of Musicians held in Omaha. During a Trans-Mississippi exposition, she read several essays upon the songs of North American Indians. She's known for Indian Story and Song from North America in 1900 and several other works. And in a lot of these works, she frames the discussion as preservation not only for the Omaha or any of the other Native American groups that she works with, but also in the context of the larger United States, like, for example, how music and themes from music and folklore can be utilized by American composers and artists to create their own works. And we see here, I think we see here sort of the early tension that might exist in anthropology with collecting this data, and then also how it will subsequently be used. Today, of course, we have this mired in discussions of intellectual property rights as a whole. Otis Mason comes to anthropology by way of actually preaching. He established the Woodlawn Baptist Church and preached there for 4 years before they actually got a preacher. And he, like the others, believe in a stepwise evolution of culture and that technology becomes a key marker in a culture's stage of development. He was a collaborator in ethnology at the Smithsonian Institute, so very much in line with Powell in this frame. He prepares a number of publications from the Smithsonian. And as I mentioned, the Smithsonian is, if you get a position as an ethnologist, ethnographer at the Smithsonian, this is a very research-intensive type of work, and you will likely publish more than academic counterparts that might not appear in peer-reviewed publications, but would appear in what we might refer to as the white or the gray literature, technical reports, and these sorts of things. But certainly a robust source of resource for ethnographers or anthropologists looking to do field work. And this historical work forms the basis of that. He was the president of the Anthropological Society in Washington from 1892 to 1895, the acting head curator of the Department of Anthropology at the Smithsonian, and the head curator at the Smithsonian from 1905 to 1908. James Mooney was coming to anthropology through by way of he was a teacher first and then a newspaper man. He worked for the Bureau of Ethnology between 1885 and 1921. He was author of works on the Cherokee. He had spent long periods of time doing field work there from 1887 all the way through to his death in 1921. He had also worked with other southeastern tribes, including the Kiowa and other Plains tribe. He also researched the Southwest amongst the Pueblos and Northern Plains tribe. He is known for his cross-cultural studies on both the ghost dance religion as well as the use of peyote. Frank Cushing, who was mentioned earlier, again, I personally believe this is a key figure in early American anthropology. There is much debate and discussion about who originated the ideas of participant observation. Malinowski is often credited with this. However, Frank Cushing's early field work indicates participant observation. There are some questions about how native he went and how this might have influenced his work. But again, these are larger questions within anthropology as a whole, this idea of objectivity and reflexivity. He was appointed curator of the ethnological department at the National Museum in Washington, D.C., and was invited by Powell to join an anthropological expedition to New Mexico. He situated himself in the Zuni Pueblo between 1879 and 1884. He went native, essentially becoming a member of the priesthood of the bow in 1881. He was given the name medicine flower Teslani by the Zuni, and he fundamentally believed as well in the reciprocal method, wherein he brought Zuni people to both Washington, D.C. and New York City in order to show them what his culture looked like. So this idea of sharing and exchange, reciprocity in the context of anthropological fieldwork. And again, this sort of foreshadows the work of more reflexive anthropologists later on. Where Cushing falls off the boat for many anthropologists as well as Zuni people is that he in fact published accounts which he didn't have the permission to publish on sacred stories and accounts of the Zuni. So he's regarded amongst some Zuni today as very damaging to long-term relationships. Although he was a very strong advocate for ceasing development in the region. There was a mining company that was going to come in, and because he was able to organize and lobby and petition for the Zuni, he was eventually removed by Powell, who was pressured from higher ups in Washington to remove Cushing from being situated on Zuni land. Franz Boas, often or sometimes referred to as the father of American anthropology, and indeed he trains, as I said before, a generation of anthropologists which influence American anthropology, both with their agreement and disagreement, and then their subsequent students that they in fact themselves taught. Probably most notable amongst these would be Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict, who we'll discuss in more detail later on when we talk about culture and personality. For Boas, the school of thought is historical particularism. This is sometimes referred to as anti-theoretical. This historical particularism is a gloss that's been put on his work by Marvin Harris in the 1960s. And essentially what Boas is maintaining is that cultures are only understandable in the context of their own historical and environmental circumstances. So for Boas, theory emerges over time. The way you build theory is through collection of data from a wide set of different cultural contexts. Boas did his PhD in the physical sciences on the contribution to the understanding of the color of water. And in his work on the Baffin Islands, he came to certain realizations and really pens the first sort of statements of cultural relativism. The idea of a cultured individual is merely relative and that a person's worth should be judged by his education of the heart. This quality is present or absent here amongst the Eskimo, just as among us. He is also responsible and noted for his work in developing four-field anthropology that had influenced my own education at the University of Florida. And the different departments will integrate four-field approach in graduate studies as well. He critiqued unilineal evolutionists primarily on the unscientific nature of the previous studies that had been done. So he always was attacking methodology, even though he fundamentally disagreed with the underlying assumptions they made.